Welcome back. Now, Puccini's opera Madama Butterfly was, believe it or not, a massive flop on its first performance on the 17th of February in 1904. The audience openly heckled the show and mocked and jeered the composer. So Puccini went back to the drawing board and reworked the opera. By the time it had its UK debut here at Covent Garden a year later, it was a shorter and more essential work, tautly telling the tragic life of a young Japanese girl. Well, joining me now to talk more about the checkered history of the opera is Alexandra Wilson from Oxford Brookes University. Alex, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
You're welcome.
Thinking about Madama Butterfly now, and particularly here tonight, it's hard to believe it was never anything other than a huge success for Puccini, but that negative reaction really affected him, didn't it?
It did. He received a lot of criticism, surprisingly, during his lifetime, and he always took it very personally. And it's said that after the Butterfly fiasco, which is one of the great operatic fiascos in all operatic history, it's said that he couldn't leave the house for a fortnight. He was so devastated. But, he had a feeling it was personal, that there'd been what they call a claque, an organised group in the audience who were there, paid by a rival publishing house to disrupt the performance.
Right.
Now, it's never been absolutely proven, but they did have these claques who would turn up and either really cheer and shout in favour of a performance or disrupt it. So it's quite conceivable that could have happened.
And he really took it to heart.
He did. I mean, as you say, he got back to work and the second version came out pretty quickly. But it did set him back, I think, because it took him another 6 years before his next opera appeared. So there were sort of long-term consequences, I think.
Now, we know that he deleted some scenes, he added a few more scenes. Do you know much about his working process? How did he write these operas?
Well, it's funny, if we see photos of Puccini, we don't actually see many of him in the act of composing. We don't often see him at the piano. We more often see him having this kind of debonair, man-about-town lifestyle and hunting and shooting and so on. It was a very collaborative process with his two librettists. They would sort of push the work backwards and forwards between them. He had an input into the drama as well as into the music.
Ultimately, of course, he has had the last laugh over the critics. This opera is absolutely a triumph. One thing that Tony Pappano mentioned earlier was, of course, the influence of those Japanese sounds on Puccini. And he wasn't alone in that regard, being captivated by Japan. We think of the vogue that it was in fashion, of course, in decorative arts, in visual arts. We think of the likes of Debussy and Degas, Van Gogh, all interested in Japan. What do you think that obsession was all about at that time?
Well, it was a novelty. I mean, it was the fashion, it was the vogue. Japan had been a very, very closed society for centuries, and it was only in the mid-19th century that it sort of starts to open up to the West. And so there are trade agreements, and these objects start to be imported, and they're on sale just down the road from here in Liberties, for example, China and prints and so on. But then composers start to get interested, and Puccini really liked to do his research. So he didn't just sort of use generic Eastern cliched language as imagined by Western composers. He actually listened to some very early recordings of Japanese music, and he uses about 10 original Japanese folk tunes in the score. Of course, the music isn't entirely Japanese. He's got to create a very Western sound, an American sound for Pinkerton. And so you have him quoting what was then the US Navy anthem, the Stars and Stripes. And of course, Butterfly's music is a mixture of the two. So sometimes she sounds very Japanese, and sometimes she sounds full-on Western, lyrical, romantic heroine. And I think that sort of sums up the conflict that's in her character.
Well, certainly the culture clash that's right at the heart of this opera. He, of course, said that God commanded him to write only for the theatre. He is an exemplary writer of opera in terms of being able to combine the music and the drama. What do you think it is about him that makes these operas so compelling?
I think he was very much inspired by the visual, which is quite unusual for a composer. So he came to this subject matter not through reading the story, but through watching it as a play. And he didn't even understand. He saw the play in English. He didn't speak English, but he was completely bowled over by it. And it was all to do with the visual aspects, the lighting. And he notes the details into the scores of what he wants to see, very precise, the visual details. But I think also musically, his musical language is so naturalistic. he just throws us into the. We feel as though we've come into the middle of something. The music doesn't stop and start in that very formal way that earlier Italian opera would have done. So sort of mid-period Verdi, you know when to stop and applaud.
Yeah.
In Puccini, it's much more like film music. It follows the flow and the essence of the drama.
And it is certainly as captivating as any film. Thank you so much, Alexandra. Wonderful to have you
Pleasure.
with us. And of course, the musical and emotional challenges set by Giacomo Puccini for his star soprano in Madama Butterfly are enormous. The range of characterization from that demure 15-year-old girl that we see at the beginning to a passionate lover to, as we will see, a tragic heroine, all reflected in his huge vocal demands. During rehearsals, we went into the studio with Erminella Yaho and Antonio Pappano to take a deeper look at this iconic role.
You say to him, love me, vogliatemi bene, but a small love, un bene piccolino. In Italian, that little piccoli. And then you have the answer in the orchestra. So full of little effects of the night and night sounds and yeah, Japanese delicacy.
Well, there's so many colors there, you know, to describe her simplicity, vulnerability, and she's in love. Sometimes the simple things are the most important in our lives. And she believes, blindly she believes. It's amazing.
The curtain rises on Act 2 and completely different atmosphere. 3 years have gone by. Pinkerton has sailed off and left you alone, and yet you believe he will return. There's a tension between you and Suzuki, your handmaid. She prays to her Shinto god, but she prays also that you will stop crying. My pure. And this very revealing music. You say that the Japanese gods are fat and lazy.
True.
Yeah, can you, pigri od obesi, can you make that obese, that sound a little bit longer? So just a little bit without doubling the B, if you do. Yes.
Butterfly, she believes, no matter what. And Suzuki is there like a mirror. She knows that it's not going to happen.
In fact, you get really angry with her negativity, don't
True.
you? She bursts into tears, and you say, piangi, perché, perché, why are you crying? You don't have faith.
True.
And then listen. Let's look at that phrase. It's suspended. It's very high in range because you're saying one day we will see smoke rising on the horizon at sea, and then the boat will appear. You're doing una bella. I think you can do it without repeating the consonants. Try to really get that seamless line, almost like that smoke that you're talking about. amazing, the push and pull of this music. It's so spontaneous and like a narrative. Of course, you and I have to be moving together. You know?
Absolutely,
It's one of the great challenges of Puccini is actually this relationship between singer and conductor, because everything is governed by not only the melody but the words and the story that's being told. So there's what we call rubato, tempo rubato, which it's stolen time. The idea of push and pull in music, you know, always kind of giving and taking, giving and taking. You have nothing in your hand except belief.
She loves Pinkerton. Even though one believes her, she believes in it.
Last crescendo. But when you see that against everybody else telling you that you're wrong, it makes your character stronger. The more you have people pushing against you, the bigger you become.
Absolutely. She's really, really strong.
Totally convinced.
Antonio Pappano, totally convinced by the incomparable Ermanela Yaho. And you can see a longer version of that film with a free digital programme on the Royal Opera House website. Well, the auditorium here is filling up, not long now until the conclusion of Puccini's Madama Butterfly. Puccini and his two librettists, Giuseppe Giacosa and Luigi Illica, were determined to avoid sentimentality and ensure that in Cho-Cho-San they created a character with strength and dignity, someone who's much more than a mere victim of her circumstances. Well, as we've just heard, in this second act we have some of Puccini's greatest music in Butterfly's aria predicting her husband's return, Un bel dì, one fine day. And then, during her vigil for Pinkerton, we hear the unmistakable humming chorus. But with these great pleasures comes the pain of the inevitable heartbreak at the conclusion of Puccini's Madama Butterfly, live from the Royal Opera House, Covent Garden.